Early medieval cemeteries are wonderful things for storytelling. Starting in the 5th century, people in Britain and other parts of the Roman West buried their dead in new ways. In particular, they dressed the dead in innovative styles of jewelry, decorated with evocative and abstract images of mythical twining beasts. And they also buried the dead with weapons. These new traditions appear suddenly near the end of the Roman Empire. The rapidity and the occasional weirdness of this cultural shift has captured modern people's imaginations for more than 2 centuries. So for most of these 200 years, medieval cemeteries were used to justify some of the most destructive ideologies in human history. Historians and archaeologists, too, are largely to blame. In the 19th century, scholars justified their interest in Britain's early medieval artifacts by linking them to the colonial ideologies of empire. In the British Empire and in America, Anglo-Saxon history became the framing over which white supremacy and colonial expansion could be stretched. Britain's 5th and 6th centuries were vulnerable to this purpose because almost no contemporary texts survived from this era. This made it easy to impose a narrative onto the fragments. Furthermore, its artifacts are enigmatic, wildly decorated in abstract art, or just so corroded by time and decay that their original stories cease to matter. These artifacts could become what their 19th century discoverers needed them to be. In this way, scholars who studied the early Middle Ages colonized their own past, yoking it to the empires that they served. Today, Anglo-Saxon studies is both a colonized field and a colonizing tool whose edge hasn't blunted from use. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got into this mess. But I want to talk more about how we can get out. So colonialism changes how colonizers view the colonized. Colonizers count and classify the people that they subjugate, and in doing so, they become convinced that they understand indigenous societies better than these people understand themselves. Colonial scholarship of Britain's early Middle Ages has done much the same to the sources and the voices that survive from this era. We've counted and classified thousands of artifacts, and we've used them to critique our narratives about their makers. But we haven't done a good job listening to what all these artifacts have to say for themselves. Today, I'm going to look at what one kind of artifact in particular from early medieval cemeteries can tell us. That's the iron spearhead. I choose spearheads as a case study for 2 reasons. First, because spears as weapons, tools of violence, feature prominently in romantic nationalist myths about the early Middle Ages. And secondly, because spearheads are, as a group, so rusted and decayed that scholars haven't really known what to do with them, and consequently have repeatedly chosen spearheads as a convenient prop, kind of tabula rasa for settler colonial explication. But we can interrogate these artifacts using methods borrowed from the metallurgical sciences and from experimental archaeology. And when we do, they tell us new stories that can help us decolonize our field, work toward, as Carolyn said, new frameworks. So I'll unpack how this works and share one of these stories today. First, let's look more at our problem. So one framework has crowded out the rest for how we interpret the cemeteries of early medieval Britain. This is the story popularized by Victorian historians that 5th century Germanic colonizers, the Angles, the Saxons, and Utes, conquered Roman Britain and set in motion historical processes that birthed England and by extension the modern West. This story is in all the most important ways false. But archaeologists have interpreted burials from the 5th and 6th centuries through this framework since the late 1700s. So this narrative was from the beginning teleological and self-serving. Thomas Jefferson was inspired by this story to identify the Anglo-Saxons as the progenitors of American slaveholding democracy, and his successors wove Anglo-Saxon history into the 19th century American white supremacist ideology of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. In Victorian Britain, antiquarians excavated medieval artifacts in their back gardens, and to elevate what they believed to be their ancestral heritage, these early archaeologists framed the British Empire's colonial excesses abroad as the triumphant culmination of England's Germanic settler colonial progenitors who had subdued Britain's indigenous peoples. On both sides of the Atlantic, the Anglo-Saxon conquest became an origin myth for the modern era. It was adopted across the British educational system by the 20th century, and historians here in America incorporated it into our Western civilization curricula. Today, this story remains the predominant framework applied to new mortuary discoveries by 21st century scholars of early medieval Britain. Over the past decades, however, scholars have thoroughly deconstructed the factual basis of this narrative. Textual historians have dismantled our confidence in the scattering of cherry-picked written sources on which it was originally based, and archaeologists have critiqued both the evidence and the assumptions that underpin the invasion narrative. We now know that while people did move across the North Sea in late antiquity, these migrations looked nothing like the settler colonial genocide that Victorian scholars popularized. Recent isotopic, tooth enamel studies, and genomic studies of human remains from the early Middle Ages have confirmed that late antique Britain's cultural transformations didn't follow a mass migration event. In fact, most of the people Victorian scholars identified as Anglo-Saxons were the same Roman and British farmers who had been living on the island for generations. The Anglo-Saxons as a people or as a culture never existed outside our modern mythology. And David Wilton has a paper that came out on this that's really good. Nevertheless, new work in our field continues to focus on Germanic invasion and colonization, despite often making explicit claims to provide new frameworks. In most of these new studies, the narrative returns, in the end, to the question, what can this tell us about the putative arrival of the Angles and Saxons? Or else, can this era's material remains help us to understand the emergence of a Germanic or an Anglo-Saxon ethnicity in 5th, 6th, or 7th century Britain? The questions lurking in the background, sometimes made explicit, are these people England's ancestors? Can they help us discover the origins or the emergence of the English? As scholars struggle to escape the deconstructed husk of Victorian historiography, contemporary white supremacists are enthusiastically adopting medieval imagery, and they're using our scholarship to justify their ideologies. We're all by now, I suspect, familiar with images like this one of rioters at Charlottesville wielding shields emblazoned with medieval symbols, or flags with Anglo-Saxon and Viking runes, reflecting a popular perception that the early Middle Ages were a time when these men's supposedly white and Germanic ancestors exercised violence unconstrained by modern sensibilities. The Anglo-Saxons weren't politically correct. Many medieval scholars have called displays like this appropriation, but others, particularly Mary Rambaran-Olm, Adam Miyashiro, James Harland, have shown that modern racist medievalism is built on the same Victorian scaffolding as our professional scholarship. The settler colonial narrative that draws a straight line from English and WASP identity back in time to a primordial Germanic violence. And this ideology causes immeasurable harm to white supremacy's victims in the present, and it also erases the history of millions of real people who lived in late antique Britain, subsuming their lives and even their graves and their actual bones inside a national project that treats them like data to be classified, to order to our modern identities, in order that our modern identities and our political projects can use to remain secure. Early medieval artifacts will help us to destabilize these meta-narratives if we let them. Artifacts, material things, actively shape the social settings in which they're found. They're parts of social machines, interlocking systems of people and materials that in totem constitute past society. Early medieval artifacts today are separated from those past systems by time, but most preserve traces in their materials that we can find if we engage with them in the right ways. These ways vary depending on what kind of artifact we're talking about, but they require us to relax our desire for order and clarity so that we can start to see artifacts' alterity, their weirdness, the things that don't fit inside our tidy hegemonic stories. In this, I'm following archaeologist Tim Webmore's call for us to take things seriously as social agents, and anthropologist Tim Ingold's admonition that engagement, working practically with materials, offers a more powerful procedure of discovery than an approach bent on the abstract analysis of things already made. Bearing this in mind, let's look at our artifact, the iron spearhead. Spearheads have been at the heart of Anglo-Saxon conquest narrative since the beginning. About half of the men, and quite a few women, but my field hasn't talked about them much for the reasons that will soon become clear, half the men who died in late antique Britain were buried with a spear. Sometimes other weapons were buried with them as well, but spears were the most common by a factor of 1 to 10. Scholars early on identified these weapons as belonging to Germanic conquerors, and almost all subsequent analyses of this artifact have taken for granted that spears embodied, literally or symbolically, the violence through which Germanic invaders, as the story goes, subdued Britain's indigenous population. Michael Swanton used spearheads to trace the paths of Germanic conquest. Heinrich Herka compared weapon burial to violent graffiti in Northern Ireland meant to intimidate a colonized people. Nick Stoodley argued that spears symbolized the masculinity of the Germanic dead, and Stoodley worked very hard to prove that women were never buried with spears. Even those who reject the conquest narrative slip back into settler colonial paradigms. Franz Teusch, for example, argued that spears and axes were buried with the late antique dead to represent their symbolic conquest of the trees and animals of the empty wilderness. All these interpretations treat spearheads as a tabula rasa, an artifact that clearly meant something to the people who buried them, but whose precise meaning is now so obscured behind sometimes truly horrendous corrosion that no one can really object when they're used as proof of the unapologetic masculinity or the unconstrained violence of Britain's supposed colonizers. Beneath the rust, however, spears do have stories to tell, and they do object to some of these characterizations. To recover those stories, we have to grab a microscope. So much like a palimpsest manuscript, iron artifacts preserve traces beneath their surfaces of the different events each experienced before it was buried in the ground. Heating, hammering, and hardening iron changes the metal on a microscopic level. These changes accrue inside the artifact over its lifetime. Using a laboratory technique called metallography, a metallurgical scientist can observe the microstructures that accrued inside an artifact, and from these can reconstruct the artifact's history. About 1,000 spearheads have been excavated from late antique British cemeteries in the last 30 years, and so far 73 of these have been analyzed using metallography. Metallography is a destructive test. A technician cuts a cross-section out of the artifact and then polishes it so that a researcher can look at it under an optical microscope from which they can see the microscopic crystalline structures in the metal. And this allows them to reconstruct the metal's composition, to measure its properties, and also to trace the history of the artifact. If artifacts are not too rusted from their time in the soil, these histories can be quite detailed, and we're going to look at some of them in just a minute. Metallography tries to reverse engineer the events that made an artifact the way it is today. We're going back in time, much like an archaeologist digs down through layers of soil. Experimental archaeology, in contrast, gives us a way to test these laboratory conclusions by putting an exacting modern reproduction of the artifact through the same history that we think happened to the original. A metallurgist can then analyze the reproduction using metallography to see if microstructures match the original find. This two-pronged approach, working backwards and forwards, can reveal a lot of the assumptions that we bring to the table about ancient technological processes, many of which, of course, turn out to be much more complicated than we realized when we started. And this raises some interesting new questions about our rusty artifacts. So one of the most striking things that we've learned from metallography is how complex and carefully made these now rusty lumps of metal once were. Most of the spearheads that we've analyzed were welded together from multiple types, different alloys of iron. These alloys were welded together in a way that took advantage of each kind of metal's particular unique metallurgical properties. And also that it was often beautiful, the way that they combined them together. So this spearhead from Wasperton, and we're looking at a magnified view, a schematic drawing in the upper left, and then a picture of the cross-section in the lower right. This spearhead was made from at least 5 different bars of metal. 3 of them are soft iron and 2 of them are high carbon steel. The steel was carefully welded to the iron bars, and it's a multi-step process to get that construction. And that encased the steel cutting edges in a soft but strong supporting shell. The blade was then heated and quenched in water, which hardened the steel edges. All of these actions made skillful use of the different properties of these different kinds of metal that were being welded together. The person who made this blade knew how to work iron very well. We see this skill again and again across the artifacts we've analyzed. Here in this spearhead, and I've just got a schematic drawing of this one, 3 different kinds of iron are welded together. There's a piece in the middle, and then that dark band is another kind of iron with phosphorus in it. And then on the outside, we have high carbon steel to give it a good cutting edge. These different kinds of iron were also different colors. Here we have a reproduction of the artifact. And you can see the different patterns and banding on the spearhead give it an artistic effect as well as giving it a hardened edge. The edge of the spearhead was martensite, a hard steel construction. This spearhead was made from 3 bars, a strong core of iron and 2 delicate strips of steel that the blades maker carefully welded onto opposite sides of the blade. And welding very thin bars of steel like this is really hard. If any of you have ever forged welded before, the spearhead is only about this big, so we're talking almost like wire-thin pieces of steel. You only have about a second to do that before the metal's too cold. You have to start over. The person who made this was a very good smith. And once it was finished, the blade was inexplicably reheated in a fire for such a long time that all the hardness that they gained from welding the steel edges was stripped away. These two spearheads from the same cemetery were just as carefully made, but they also were inexplicably put back in the fire after they were manufactured until every last bit of hardness was stripped from their blades. And here you can see the effects of this low heating on a micrograph from one of those spearheads. Remember that image of steel that we had where it looked like a very dense field? Here, all of the carbon has kind of pulled together like little droplets of water. All of that carbon's pulled out of the iron, leaving the iron soft. And that's what happens when you reheat a piece of steel and ruin its hardness. So in cemeteries across England, we see the same thing time and again. Spearheads that were very artfully made by skilled smiths to have hard, strong blades, people who went to a lot of work to put steel on the edges of these blades, but were subsequently reheated until all their hardness was stripped away. In total, 26% of the spearheads that we've analyzed with metallography were hardened only to be softened later. David Starley, examining the spearheads from Wasperton, thought they might have been burned in a bonfire. Other researchers have struggled to make sense of this evidence, the apparent incongruity between the skill in forging each blade and the final destructive reheating. Starley suggested that these weapons could have been burned on purpose to destroy them, a kind of killing rite or a deliberate sacrifice during the funeral. Others speculated instead that spearheads may have been softened as some sort of byproduct of a manufacturing process that we don't understand. So I tested these ideas experimentally. I forged reproductions of early medieval spearheads using recycled wrought iron salvaged from a demolished historical property that had comparable metallurgy to the original artifacts. I forged these reproductions using a variety of methods to test the various theories proposed to explain the weirdly softened blades. But only two of my tests, however, reproduced the types of microstructures that we see in early medieval artifacts. One of these is the spear that I had burned for several hours in a bonfire, like David Starley suggested. The other I heated and cooled a dozen times in a charcoal forge. Neither reheating process offers any benefits to the blade. They're exactly the opposite of what you should do if you're trying to make a good spearhead. They're utterly destructive to the metallurgy, and they match the original artifacts. So something interesting is happening here with these spearheads, and it doesn't really fit with what we understand about our conquering Anglo-Saxons who are burying weapons with the dead as some sort of chauvinistic display of how strong and tough they are. Altogether, a quarter of these spears that are buried in graves were set on fire first. Some of them were burned in a bonfire, others appear to have been decommissioned by an expert blacksmith who knew how to strip this out in their forge. Once I noticed this, I started looking for more evidence of deliberate destruction in these graves, and I found that even more spears, about half of the total, also had broken shafts. The weapons weren't being displayed with the dead here, some sort of intimidating threat or a display of martial masculinity. They're being destroyed using multiple techniques, some of them expert techniques, perhaps even during the funeral or as part of the burial rite. And most of this destruction is now invisible, but it was obvious to contemporaries. When you burn a spearhead, its color changes. Here's what it looks like before and after. The one on the right, kind of bright in here, but it's turned blue and has got red spots on it. These are different kinds of corrosion. It looks nothing like the original shiny, polished spearhead. This discolored surface, though, it rusts away really quickly. So it leaves no trace 1,500 years later when we dig these spearheads up, except inside the blade's metallurgy. Similarly, most spear shafts are too decayed when we excavate a grave for us to tell right away whether they're broken or not, unless we're looking for it. But contemporaries witnessed the broken shafts and burned spearheads firsthand, and many of them may have helped to break and burn and destroy these artifacts at the funeral. Until we placed the spearheads under a microscope, we saw a man prepared for violence. Not a woman, a man. Even before we analyzed the bones for markers of sex, archaeologists often conclude the sex of the individual because we have the story in mind. We see the story that we expect from the narratives that we've been handed down. But to contemporaries, this was a broken or decommissioned weapon that was placed out of reach in the soil. The grave becomes a place of action, and these actions are a little bit weird to us. We're seeing into a different time, and the past is starting to become another country, like like it's supposed to be, rather than just an extension of our own hopes, fears, and political projects. And we wouldn't see this if we hadn't, to use Webmore's phrase again, taken things seriously. That is, looked beneath the artifact's surface, worked with their materials, and paid attention to what these told us, especially when it doesn't fit the narratives that we started with. This raises a lot of questions that we don't have time to answer today. Why, for example, were weapons being broken at a funeral instead of somewhere else? Why did this practice begin so suddenly at the end of the 5th century? Does it have anything to do with the breakdown of local Roman administrative institutions? Is this a new way for post-Roman farming communities to regulate access to weaponry now that they could no longer depend on the aegis of a coercive militarized state? Are weapon burials ways to purify a community of violence rather than to celebrate it, or is something else going on with these destruction practices at the graveside? Going forward, we need to be more open to hearing new questions coming out of material artifacts. We won't hear these questions unless we approach artifacts differently, not as data sets to be collected and cataloged as part of an ongoing colonial mission to bring order to Britain's chaotic archaeological past, but as material things whose physical properties preserve pieces of the ever-shifting social machines that made up late antique society. Shifting focus from macro to micro, from big data surveys of archaeological artifacts, assemblages, to close readings of individual artifacts, lets these artifacts speak, and their pronouncements make the early Middle Ages a little harder to pin down, resistant to the political narratives of modern empire and capital, and a little less familiar. And that's a good thing.